and talk to you a little bit more about some of the resources that we have across the university. So I am Associate Director of Entrepreneurial Programs over at the School of Management. We are essentially responsible for the curricular side of entrepreneurship, not just at the School of Management, but across Yale's campus. So most of the classes that we have outside of the class that I actually teach, ironically, are open to School of Management or joint degrees, or open to anyone from across campus, apologies. So we do actually have quite a few students who come from the med school either as joint degree students or as just interested students. There's a healthcare entrepreneurship class that's taught by Chris Luce, who many of you might know, who's over here at the med school, and Aisha Khalid. There's a great group, CBET, that's over on this side of campus that helps with innovation as well. Sci-City is an umbrella organization that goes across the entire university. They're really responsible for the extracurricular side of things on campus. So what I really wanted to talk to you today about is just give you a broad introduction to lean startup methodology. This is the methodology that we use in most of our classes over at the School of Management. It's a common methodology that's used, that's been derived in the past probably, I would say, 10 to 15 years and really honed. And you'll see a lot of Silicon Valley companies in particular following this. So it's really meant for not just high-tech, high-growth ventures, but also I use it in my class where I have a variety of people who are starting companies that are nonprofits or B Corps or other types of entities. So just going to do a quick, what is the purpose of the workshop? To get a practical understanding of lean startup, customer development, and the steps that you can take to launch a new venture. Does anybody have an idea that they're actively working on? Tell us what it is.
What's that?
You got to tell us what it is.
Oh, well, that's what I was debating whether to do.
Yeah, definitely.
We developed a model for technical assistance and training that we've now done in a lot of different states. And there's a national funder. It's mostly done with nonprofits that's working with us now to kind of create a hybrid national model that blends it with them, and then also potentially to take it national to a lot of different cities.
And what type of training are you doing?
It's a organizational capacity building focused on evaluation, but also performance improvement.
Great, useful. Anybody else? Okay, you can learn along then. So when you think about this question, what is entrepreneurship, you tend to, at least for us, we look at it in a couple of different ways. An entrepreneur is one who organizes, manages, and assumes the risk of a business or enterprise. Although this comes from Webster's Dictionary, which would not fly with the faculty at the School of Management, I actually like this definition. Howard Stevenson is a famous professor from Harvard Business School, and I think this also really talks about what you do as an entrepreneur, which is really you're working in a resource-constrained environment and trying to gather as much information as quickly as possible to build a product and get it out into the market. This is the definition that I tend to use, and I think we really like to focus on this idea of a bias towards action. And so a lot of what you see with the students in my class is really helping them get that mind shift between just kind of theoretically thinking about what a particular venture might be and actually taking those steps to get something out into the marketplace. And so it's that bias towards action to create a new product or service that solves a real problem. That is the heart of what we do in entrepreneurship for users, and brings that to the market in a sustainable way. So that can be a nonprofit model where you actually have a slate of funders and a set of programs that maybe you're charging for, or it can be, obviously traditional business models as well. So again, we start with this idea of a problem. We have our students go through this exercise with one of these problem statements. So essentially, you're really trying to figure out, again, you can come up with this great idea, and a lot of times what you see, particularly coming out of labs, is based upon research that people have done, and so it's something that they've been passionate about, likely for years and years and years. And it may be this great product, but it may not be solving a real problem for people. And so we try to frame this. Right now I have a student in the class who is working on an autonomous robot that goes across pipes in a refinery, including all the flanges and twists and turns. So highly technical robot to test for corrosion in the refinery in order to mitigate the risks that come from people being up there doing it themselves, and to early detect and substantially reduce costs for refineries. So This problem statement is something that I would encourage you, if you're thinking about something, to really either use this format or this other format, which is far more defined. So for your target customer who has a particular problem or need, whatever your product is in this category, and provides these key benefits, unlike what your competition is doing or how they're particularly solving that problem right now, your product is differentiated in this way. So obviously this example comes from Amazon. So once we've had students kind of think through what is that problem, they really do start with this vision, this idea of a vision. We try to help them figure out who is that initial target user. Traditionally in lean startup and in most startup methodologies, even kind of some of the precursors that we'll talk about in a minute, you have a situation where you want to try to get those early customers to be as narrow as possible. And the reason for that is if you're trying to really build out, it's what's called, Bill Olet up at MIT calls it a beachhead market. You want to make sure that you're kind of saturating a key target audience initially. So in doing this with students, we have them fill out what are called user personas. So if anyone's been in marketing before, which probably in this group you haven't, user personas are essentially a single individual that you craft for yourself. And you try to come up with a set of characteristics that allow you, as you're building your product, to really think about how you can build out for that particular user that represents a set of potential early users that you might have. So you really want to think about, age, all the demographic information that you might pick out: age, gender, salary, where do they work, what are their wants, needs, what are their challenges. Particularly if you're looking in the public health sector, it's really important to narrow in on kind of what are the challenges if you're delivering a service, in the way in which you're delivering that service. What are all these external factors that you need to consider when delivering those services? And you try to do this. We have our students actually, if they're working in teams, do this separately, and then come together back as a team and try to see if they all think that initial target user is the same. So as Stephanie mentioned, for me, I started a company, Skill Crush, back in 2012, which teaches women to code online. It's still up and running by my co-founder in New York City. And we knew initially that we wanted to target women in tech-adjacent roles. We'd all come from the newspaper industry, or the news industry, hardly newspaper anymore. And we knew that we wanted to target women in tech-adjacent roles in advertising, media, in large cities, aged 25 to 35. But that's still a really large group of individuals. And so if we were going to get the word out and really kind of saturate a market and be able to leverage some of the benefits that come from word of mouth, we really wanted to narrow that down. So we spent a good amount of time, and I would say several weeks, really honing in on what are the characteristics of that initial user, because it impacts everything that you do. It impacts the product that you're building. It impacts the branding that you're creating once you get that product up and out. And it impacts every other strategic thing that you have in your business model. So we really think about this user first. What is the problem? How are we solving that problem? And then how are we building a business model around that again allows us to bring that into the market in a sustainable fashion. So if you think about entrepreneurship before lean startup, this kind of goes back to, if anyone's started a company before, if you go back to kind of I would say 2005, you had this situation where a lone entrepreneur or a set of people might come together with a great idea. They could spend months, sometimes a year, putting together a detailed business plan, saying, these are our customers, this is, our marketing plan, this is our go-to-market strategy, et cetera. They would take that plan, they would go and fundraise off of it, and then they would execute from the funding. And the problem with that is you end up with a situation where it's this whole idea of if you build it, they will come. You end up with a situation where it oftentimes doesn't work. So the best example I would say of this is Webvan. When Webvan launched back in 1997, they went out and over the course of several years raised about $800 million in the public and private markets. They were trying to build out an online grocery delivery service. They built out these massive billion-dollar distribution centers in San Francisco and I believe someplace in the Southeast. And in the annual report, once they went public, they noted that they had spent 50 person years building this platform out. And the problem was they never actually went and talked to people about whether or not they wanted to order groceries off of the internet and have them delivered to their house. And so for those of you who might be like me, who might be old enough to remember what it was like in 1997, 1998, there were not a lot of people ordering a lot of things online at all. There was this big barrier to giving away your credit card, let alone having someone pick out your fruit and your vegetables and all of your stuff and having it delivered to the house. So, you know, story there is that after, I think in 2002, they went bankrupt, totally bust. So you don't really want to just kind of come up with this idea, raise the money, and execute without talking to people. So Steve Blank is the father of the lean startup methodology. He's a professor at Stanford University, also teaches a couple classes at Haas at Berkeley. And his whole thing is no business plan survives first contact with a customer. He has this mantra that is, get out of the building and go talk to customers. So no plan survives contact with the enemy, or as Mike Tyson might say, yeah, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So when you think about the lean startup methodology, what you're really trying to do is take that idea business plan part and change it. So instead of doing a linear waterfall development, essentially, of product development, you're coming up with an idea hypothesis, and for cents, or cents on the dollar, you're trying to use small tests to figure out whether or not you can find product market fit. So all of this is really based on this idea of science, something that might appeal to you. So this whole build, measure, learn loop is really at the center of what is lean startup methodology. So you come up with an idea or a hypothesis, you build a small MVP, you try to come up with that hypothesis, as you guys probably more than most people across campus understand, needs to be falsifiable. So you're really trying to incorporate data into the product development process. You build what's called a minimum viable product. You measure the outcome of those small tests, and using that data, you go back and learn. This is, of course, Harvard Business School's far more complex version of the same thing. But what I like about this is sometimes you'll hear pushback in lean startup method about the lean startup methodology that says something to the effect of, well, you know, the Henry Ford thing, if people about horses and cars, like you need to have an initial vision in order to do this. And a lot of people will say, well, customers often don't know what they want, and I don't know if you've encountered this, but the reality is that lean startup really does start with this idea of a vision, and through that vision, you're coming up with again, a small test that you can do around different elements of your business model. And then through that, you're going down this decision path of either continuing along, you validated, you know, I think that I can be able to sell this, you know, nutraceutical into this company at this rate, and I've talked to 50 people to validate that this seems like it's interesting, and I've talked to some customers to say that it's interesting, and you're collecting that data along the way and creating thresholds that you're using to measure whether or not you're meeting the minimum level of criteria to continue on or to have to pivot your idea. Don't worry about taking a picture. I can give you the slides when I'm done. Or if you're just going to shut it down. Like sometimes I have students in my class, it's a semester-long class, they'll come in with great enthusiasm, and they'll realize in the course of the first month and going out and talking to people that really nobody cares about what they're doing, and it's an impossible thing to do, or they'll figure out that it's way too expensive to execute on pieces of it, and they'll just kind of take another class for the second half of the semester. So it is this idea that a startup really is a temporary organization that's designed to search for a repeatable, scalable business model. Again, this is coming from Steve Blank. And so you're doing all of these very iterative things to figure out if what you are trying to build actually will find traction and customers in the market. So the lean startup methodology is not all new. Eric Ries, who came up with this particular name, based a lot of what he does on lean manufacturing. It also draws from agile software development process, which is rapid iterations, small batch cycles, and this idea of customer development and user-centered design, which is really anchored in user-centered design that's been done across a lot of industries for a while, but it really is a kind of combination of all of these things that makes it particularly impactful and a really good framework to use when you're trying to get something off the ground. So what is a business model canvas? This is Alex Osterwalder. I have a slide in here towards the end that will have a set of resources that you guys can look at if you're interested in learning more. But really what you're trying to get a sense of, and it seems somewhat reductionist when you look at it initially, is what are all of the components of the business model? So all of those things that would have traditionally gone in a 30, 40, 50-page business plan, how can you reduce those to the smallest possible initial hypotheses that you have, and then start building some tests around those? So, and we'll walk through these really quickly. So for customer segments, if you're thinking about it, are you trying to say, I'm going to enter a mass market or a niche market? Are you diversifying and moving into a new market? Is a multi-sided market or platform? For you guys in the healthcare space, you often also have to think about a customer segment can be how, who's going to pay for it? That is one of the biggest questions that you'll have. Is it who's going to reimburse you for the expense? Who's going to actually make the purchase? When you're thinking about your value proposition, I would encourage you to think about not, again, what you think is amazing coming out of the research that you've done for the past 10 years, which is likely amazing research, but how that solves a real problem for the potential user. Is it better performance? Are you building something that's going to work faster for the same amount of money? Is it giving them the feeling of brand and status, which not necessarily for you guys, but a lot of the companies that I have coming through, are consumer-facing companies, and they really are drawing on that brand status piece. Are you reducing the price? Are you reducing risk, which I'm sure is probably a big thing that many of you would contend with if you were launching ventures? And then thinking through, what are those channels? How are you reaching those customers? How are you finding them online? How are you, once you find them, delivering that product to them? And what level of service are you providing once you've brought them into the fold? And there's a couple of really great illustrations of customer journeys, is what we call them. So from the first point of notice with the customer all the way through how they feel once they've received the product and everything that happens in between. And so as you're thinking about building out those customer relationships, you have to think, and with all of these things, you're making these initial hypotheses. If you think that you're going to be kind of the best customer service delivering, cloud-based services over the web, and you're going to have people who are on call 24 hours to answer questions that developers may have, how much is that going to cost you? And is that a realistic hypothesis to have, or is that something that's going to drive your business out of business? What are your revenue streams? So these are a lot of the kind of traditional revenue streams. Are you going to go B2B? Are you going to go B2C? Again, for you guys, are you selling into a hospital? Are you selling into a clinic? Are you selling direct to consumer? And how does that impact your marketing expense? So if you decide on one level of, one path for pursuing revenues, and it's going into hospitals, as you guys know, because you're approached by them all the time, that requires a large sales force. And so how do you think about finding that revenue stream? What does it look like? And then how does it impact other elements of your business model? What are the key resources that you're going to need? Human resources, human capital is a big one that people often don't think about. So standard human capital, financial capital, intellectual property. What are the key activities that you're doing on a daily basis? Are you manufacturing a good? What does that look like? Or are you outsourcing that? Are you running a platform or a network? What key partnerships might you need to enter into? So for you, for instance, you've got this massive partnership that probably substantially helped you get off the ground initially. Is that something that's right for you for the long-term health of your company or your venture? Or is that something that likely should be shelved? Or how do you add additional partners if you feel like that's working well? And then again, it all comes down to kind of what's your cost structure. And for students who are building out early stage models in my class, I think this is the piece that they underestimate the most. Everybody always thinks if you're building a software-based product in particular, you think it's going to take you 6 months. It really takes you 12 months. You have to pay people the entire time. If you're building out a software-based product that requires you to have a large sales force, what is the sales cycle for the companies that you're going to be selling into? Is it 3 months or is it 2 years? Because all of those assumptions will factor into what's essentially your run rate or the amount of money that you have to get your venture off the ground. So all of that is really condensed down to this idea that a business model describes how a company creates, delivers, and captures value. And this is really the heart of what we have students do initially. And again, it seems really reductionist, but you'll see how these business model canvases evolve over the course of the semester as students get out of the building and start talking to potential customers, start talking to potential partners. And if you've had anybody or know anybody who's gone through some of the healthcare ventures class with Chris Luce, I judged those classes last week, and it's really interesting to see how quickly things can change from those initial assumptions, kind of the first day that the students come in and bond together as teams, and 7 weeks later when they've gone out and actually talked to people. So this is kind of broad scope what Steve Blank's customer development methodology is. In this, I would say here at Yale, most of the time we're dealing with, and I would say this is the case with ventures that are being supported by OCR as well, we're really dealing with kind of the first two pieces of this. So the customer discovery piece, which is what we're talking about here, getting out of the building, talking to potential customers, partners, et cetera. Customer validation. So again, once you've had those conversations and you've kind of put a stake in the ground, have you figured out whether or not what you're trying to build is saleable? So again, what does that sales cycle look like? How large of a sales force will you need? And is it going to be a big enough market that you can actually make a viable business out of it? And then trying to really execute on the company creation side is really making sure as you go out and try to make those sales that people are buying them. And then the company building is more longer term. That's kind of, I would say, 3 to 5 years out. I have a student who started a semiconductor materials company with Professor Han from the engineering department. He's about 3 years in. He's got operations in Brantford. He's got operations in China. He's raised over $10 million. And he's very much in this company building phase where he needs to figure out all of those HR systems and sales systems and incentive systems to make sure that the company that he's creating is long-term, scalable, and viable. So again, for each of these, you're kind of coming up with a stake in the ground. You're going through this process, so you'll come up with a hypothesis about who your initial customer is. And for instance, for us, again, going back to that idea of women, tech-adjacent roles, 25 to 35 in New York City, we went out and actually started talking to those customers and figuring out, where had they learned to code online? Had they taken a class online? Are they interested in learning to code? What other technical skills might they be interested in learning? And we had kind of thresholds that we built into the process that after we had spoken to enough people, if we had gathered enough information that would validate what our perception of what a potential market would be out of the small subset of people that we talked to, then we kind of move forward in different ways. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. There are some limitations to this methodology. So obviously when mistakes must be limited and can be tolerated, that, a good example of that is what Elon Musk is doing with rockets. He's obviously building MVPs and testing things, but it's a much different situation. Demand uncertainty is low. Good example here is if you find a cure for all cancers, you're not going to have a problem finding customers. So you don't really need to spend a lot of time doing customer discovery, specifically looking at potential target users. And then when demand uncertainty is high but development cycles are long, I think for some of this is what you saw with the clean tech industry in all of these long-term projects that they built out that had high technical kind of hurdles to hit. And oftentimes, I think they were overly optimistic about what the willingness to buy was once that product was built. So again, Steve Blank has this idea of getting out of the building, so we encourage our students to get out of the building and ask more questions. So what do some of those initial MVPs or tests look like? We'll walk through a couple of these. Again, customer interviews, easiest thing. You can find enough information in talking to 100 people about a particular idea before you go out and actually build a product and spend a lot of money. And that's kind of the easiest low-hanging fruit in terms of figuring out whether anybody cares. And particularly important, I would say, for some of the types of ventures. So in one of the presentations last week, one of the students was trying to come up, and again, these are projects that were done over the course of 7 weeks, so they hadn't had the opportunity to do all of this in that short of a period of time, but they had this idea that they wanted to try to decrease the depression rates and the utilization of healthcare clinics on campuses because they've been overloaded in the past couple of years by coming up with an app that would help students build community and feel like they're part of something. So it had some kind of psychology, psychiatry incorporated into it, mental health benefits, but then also was really meant to be an app that would talk about things that were going on across campus for students who were, first-year students who may not know, or a couple of years in who may not know, that would make them feel like a part of a community and less likely to be sitting in their dorm rooms and being depressed. And one of the assumptions that they had, which was the one that I think I gave them pushback on in the meeting, or in the pitches, was that those of us across campus who run all of these events all of the time would be interested in having another place where we had to advertise an event. And there's just not a chance. Like, we would never use this. And the app itself was dependent upon people like me and putting that information in and providing it for the students. And then also, it was meant to be like, oh, if it's 6 o'clock at night, what can I check and see what's going on around Yale's campus? And I'm like, we have people sign up, it costs us money, like there's registrations, there's all of these hurdles that they just hadn't thought through, and they hadn't thought through talking to a particular target user of the application that was really important. So I encourage them to do so. So we'll talk about a couple of these other things. Pre-sales are things that you'll see like Kickstarter, Indiegogo. I don't know if any of your friends have asked you to contribute to any of these projects, but I've had 2 companies do this who've gone through my program. Both of them raised $30,000. One was for a brewery that's triple bottom line brewery, where they're trying to hire individuals from the community who've had a hard time getting jobs and be this kind of community hub in Philadelphia. They raised $30,000 off of that, which allowed them to kind of get the initial brewing equipment that they needed. And then I had another company, Tuckerman, which is 100% organic men's clothing, and they raised $30,000. And so, good way to check. AdWords is a simple way to check. If you throw up an ad, you can say, okay, well, I'm going to put an ad here. I'm going to spend $100. I expect, 20 people to click on this ad, and I'll view that as success. We'll talk a little bit about Wizard of Oz in a second. Paper mock-ups, if you're building any web-based products, really are the simplest way to get, your idea on paper. I personally really advocate for students who are building web or mobile applications to detail it. You don't necessarily have to use one of the softwares. There's many software that's out there that's free, basically, that can allow you to build prototypes online. You can start simply with just a paper prototype and a drawing, and what it does is it forces you to really think through. A lot of times when students think about a product that they want to build, they think about all of the potential bells and whistles that can be in that product. And if you have to put that down on a piece of paper, it really begins to force you to narrow down the scope of what that initial product can be. Because with each additional product attribute that you're adding to a digital product, you're just increasing the level of complexity. And it's also, everybody can draw, it's pen and paper. So I think when you're thinking about some of these, just to go back to this really quickly, I do want to talk about couple more of these things. When you're thinking about building out that MVP, you can constrain things in certain ways. So if you think about constrained product functionality, again, the whole goal is to build something that's small enough for you to gather information without you having to put in a lot of time, money, and energy to build out a full-fledged product. For us at Skill Crush, we started out with a standalone newsletter that was this once-a-day tech term that we sent out to each of us. There were 3 co-founders. Each of us sent to 500 people, and the first day we had 500 people sign up. Within the first month, we had 2,000 people sign up. By the time we launched our paid product, we launched in April, we launched our paid product in December, we had 7,500 people on our mailing list. So we already had a set of existing users that we could then say, who are getting a product for free. That product was essentially a small piece of what the final product would be, which is a fully fledged online course. But we already knew that they liked the tone of voice, that they found the content interesting, that they found it engaging because they were sharing it. And we were able to take that then and generate $10,000 in sales the first month we put up a paid product. So just making sure that you're trying to figure out what are those small ways in which you can do that. And so for us, I was clearly like constrained product functionality. Another good example of this is when Intuit built out TurboTax, they were trying to figure out if people would be willing to go online and do their taxes. They didn't build out TurboTax for every single state in the country because the complexity of all of the different tax laws would have made that a massive product to build. And so they started just with users in California, built an initial product that was constrained from a functionality perspective, and use that to say, all right, we've got enough users now to justify starting to figure out how to build this product and roll it out across other states. Constrained operational capability is this idea of using technology to deliver an MVP where the functionality is only temporary or makeshift. And so in the Silicon Valley world, there's this accelerator called Y Combinator, which is run by this guy, Paul Graham. And he kind of focuses or forces his companies to focus on this idea of initially doing things that don't scale. And so if you look at the co-founder of Aardvark, which was essentially supposed to be a Q&A system when it was a fully fledged baked product that would allow you to enter any question and then have human beings give you suggestions for answers. So as opposed to saying, Google, find me a restaurant in New Haven, you could put in what's the best Cuban restaurant in New Haven and have people within your social network respond to that. And so initially their product was just, I think it was a box on the web. And then behind the scenes, they would send out an email to all of their friends and say, hey, who has a suggestion for this? And then surface that back to the person via text. And so it was not at all a fully baked product that would have taken 3-6 months to build. It was kind of put together with tape and toothpicks. And then like constrained product functionality, operational capability. I think this is this idea of the smoke tests on here. And good example of this is Drew Houston when he was building Dropbox, which just went public about 6 months ago. Didn't actually build out a fully fledged product. He took a web page, put on an email capture, simple embedded email capture, and did a video about what the product would be once it was built. And from that got like 100,000 people to sign up and say, yes, I am interested in this product if you can actually build it. Clearly he had a vision and an idea of what that product would be. And so he was able to create a video. The video happened to go viral because there were a bunch of Easter eggs, which are little, how to describe, little pieces in the video that were fun puzzles so that people who were in the know, who would be the potential users of that product, thought it was clever and shared it with a lot of their friends. So Rent the Runway is another really good example of this. Rent the Runway is a place where you can go and rent dresses that would normally cost $2,000 for, $100 for a night. It was launched by a Yale grad, Jenny Fleiss, and her co-founder up at Harvard Business School. And initially, what they wanted to do was to go to major designers and say, just really quickly, Stephanie, this is 10 or 11:15, okay. And say, we want to create white label software, so you, Diane von Furstenberg, can take our software, brand it with Diane von Furstenberg, and then you can rent dresses to individuals. And they kind of got laughed out of the room on that one. But they still thought there was something with this idea of being able to rent a dress. And so they started to do a set of small tests. They were up at HBS. They invited 134 people to come to their house. They borrowed dresses from friends and bought a handful of them, but really kind of borrowed the inventory from their friends, had a cocktail party, and basically tried to figure out of all these 125 people who showed up, who was going to borrow the dresses. And so they had basically 34% of the people, those women were able to come in, they were able to try them on, come in and rent the dresses. And from that, they were trying to figure out also, if someone rents a dress, is it going to come back in good repair? So you have all these small sets of hypotheses that are embedded into that business model that will really substantially impact the ability for you to actually figure out if the business model is going to work. And so one of them clearly was, are they going to return them in good repair? Are they going to return them in a timely fashion? And so they figured out that 75% of the women who rented the dresses brought them back within 24 hours. All but 2 of the dresses that were rented came back in good repair, so 51 of 53. And then they really needed to figure out whether or not, okay, we figured out, yes, women are willing to rent dresses that have previously been worn, but are they going to be able to do it if they're doing this by themselves in a room and they aren't able to try them on? And so they sent out a PDF with just a list of dresses and sizes, and 5% of the 1,000 people that were on that mailing list actually rented them. So from that, they were able to say, all right, well, this is a real legitimate potential market. Let's take this, let's go and try to raise some money and build out a larger platform. This is Tony Hsieh, who's the founder of Zappos. And when he was, again, this was early days of the internet, a lot of people were not accustomed to buying things online, and certainly buying attire was one thing that they weren't accustomed to doing because, again, this question of if I can't try it on, what happens? And so he didn't actually purchase any inventory. He went to a local Foot Locker. He took pictures of sneakers. He put them up online. If somebody actually purchased a pair of sneakers, he would go to Foot Locker, he'd buy the sneakers, he'd package them up, and he'd sell them to them. And again, before investing $2 or $3 million in a website, he validated that there were this set of customers there that cared about what he was trying to put out into the world. So when you're thinking about building out this minimum viable product and you're trying to get from point A to point B, essentially, so if you're trying to build something that's helping people get from point A to point B, you don't start with a wheel. You really want to make sure that there is some functional element to whatever MVP is that you're creating. You start with a skateboard. So again, there's this idea of in customer development of it all being quite iterative. Is this a problem that people want to have solved? Does your solution actually solve the problem? And you find out a lot by talking to people or observing them. Can you grow end user demand, and can you actually build out those systems to have a long-standing profitable company, or nonprofit in that case? So this is our original Skill Crush website. It's so hideous, it's hilarious. But this is what we sent to our friends that first day, and it was literally just a sign-up box. If you are going to do this, realize that there are pretty significant rules around your inbox, and so MailChimp has a bunch of really good guides. Look at them, because you can get frozen out basically if you do something incorrectly, if you're essentially spamming your users. So we started with this. Again, we started with that standalone newsletter. We incorporated into that newsletter. It was kind of, it was silly, ridiculous stuff. It allowed us to test our tone of voice and the content itself. And, are we starting with base level content, HTML, CSS? Or are we going to kind of jump into Python, see how that makes people feel? It allowed us to test a lot of things without doing anything other than creating an email, which is pretty easy to do. Once we got those users. We launched that first site in December, generated $10,000 in revenues. For this, though, we didn't even have a payments structure set up. And truth be told, staying in this room, our site is still built on WordPress, which is pretty insane. We never built out a fully fledged web application. We were able to incorporate all of these pieces that were plugins on WordPress to give the set of functionality that we needed to make this work. That first class was a pretty simple front-end web design class, and then we moved into all of these other classes. Again, along the line, or all along the process, we were constantly talking to people. That first summer when we had our first video, we assumed that people cared about video production. And so we spent an enormous amount of money having like our first video produced. I think it was like $4,000 or $5,000. It was ridiculous. And then we did a video that we just did by ourselves using an SLR. Nobody cares about video quality. They care about the quality of the content. And so we got that in front of users. We would go to a coffee shop in Dumbo in New York City, say that person looks like they might be in our target demographic, offer them a gift card for coffee, and have them sit down and go through the product and give us feedback. And now the site is much larger. So this is kind of the initial phases. Again, we used Gumroad, which is a payments platform. So people could take the class, but we didn't have to deal with payments. Payments is a big headache online still. And before we built in any of this other functionality, being able to take multiple classes, being able to have different types of kind of packages around our classes, we really did all these initial tests. And now the site, again, is much larger. We have elements in it that are very interactive. And again, this is a plugin. You can go online basically, and it allows you to code, and it's like an in-browser development environment essentially. And we didn't build that. We plugged it in. So we have a blog, et cetera, and we've over $3 million in revenue per year. It's profitable. It's been profitable essentially since year 2. So again, these are some of the tools that we use. I would recommend for you guys in particular, if you're trying to do something in the medical, med tech space, or if you're going down the FDA approval path, really try to look at 4 Steps to Epiphany, which is Steve Blank's book. It's a little bit more rigorous. I will tell you, it's self-published, so it's actually really hideous, but the information that's in there is really valuable. Startup Owner's Manual is another one that's a little bit more rigorous. It talks about that whole concept of, how do you figure out your sales cycle? How do you find your key buyers within organizations? And it's a little bit more in depth than what you might find in Eric Ries's book, The Lean Startup, which just gives you kind of a basic overview of the methodology. One of my favorite books that we give to students that you can get online for free is called Talking to Humans. I suspect many of you have probably already done this in other contexts in your lives and experiments, but it essentially walks people through how they actually have those conversations and add, again, into the process this element of falsifiability. So I will leave you with this, which is really, if you've got an idea, just start working on it. If it takes you much longer, it takes longer, but a lot of times people just get stuck in analysis paralysis and they don't actually try to put it out into the world, and no better time than to try to start something. I think there's so many critical needs in the healthcare space right now that can be dealt with using technology, and so I encourage you all to go forward. So.